Normandy, France, July 19. The sun rises slowly over the patchwork fields, casting long shadows over the smoke-filled battlefield. The thick fog of war lingered, while the hum of artillery fire echoes in the distance. Amid the chaos, the ground trembles. A German tank crew, crouched low in their steel behemoth, watches through their periscope. They've just wiped out another American Sherman tank, but as they shift their gaze, they see something that shocks them: another American tank. The crew had expected it to take days, maybe weeks, before the Americans could muster the strength to replace their losses. But here it is, moving through the smoke, fresh and ready for battle. It's not just one tank, it's a whole line of them. The Germans are stunned. How are they doing this? Just days ago, their intelligence reports had claimed that the Americans were struggling to keep up with tank losses. But in Normandy, the Americans seemed to have an endless supply of fresh tanks. No matter how many they destroyed, no matter how many they crippled, more American tanks kept appearing as if they were conjured from thin air. The Germans can't comprehend it. They just keep coming. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had opened up a new chapter in the Western Front of World War II. The beaches had been secured, and American forces, along with their British and Canadian allies, were now deep in German-occupied France. The Normandy campaign, however, was not just a battle of infantry and artillery, it was a battle of logistics. As the Allies advanced, they faced not only entrenched German defenses, but also the very terrain itself: fields, forests, and hedgerows that created ideal hiding spots for the enemy. Yet, what should have slowed the Americans down only seemed to fuel their momentum. Unlike the Germans, who had learned to rely heavily on the fortifications of the land, the Americans had a new weapon at their disposal: the ability to replace and repair their tanks at an astonishing rate. The M4 Sherman, the mainstay of the American armored forces, was often seen as inferior to its German counterparts, particularly the Panther and the mighty Tiger I. The Sherman had a lighter armor, a less powerful gun, and its mobility was considered an advantage over raw firepower. But what the Germans didn't account for was the American capacity to replace their losses faster than the Germans could destroy them. In early June 1944, as American forces pushed through Normandy, tank losses were inevitable. It was a brutal and grinding battle. German anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust, and the heavy firepower of German tanks took a devastating toll on the American. At times, entire tank platoons were wiped out in a matter of hours. Yet, for every tank lost, there seemed to be another ready to take its place. The German High Command had expected a slow, attritional fight, where the destruction of American tanks would gradually hinder the Allies' advance. They knew the Allies lacked the heavy artillery and armor to challenge German tanks directly, and they assumed the Sherman tanks would fall behind once the casualties mounted. But the Germans had made a critical miscalculation. They hadn't accounted for the American industrial might, their superior logistical infrastructure. The U.S. Tank Battalion were not only supported by powerful factories back home, but also by an efficient supply chain system that could get replacements to the front lines faster than the Germans could destroy the existing one. The tank repair depots, mobile repair units, and continuous production lines meant that a Sherman tank lost in battle could often be replaced or repaired and sent back into the fight within days or even hours. This constant replenishment shocked German officers. They had assumed that infantry superiority and better tanks would be enough to slow the American advance. But when they saw fresh American armor rolling into battle after each engagement, it became clear that the Germans faced a new kind of enemy, one that could replace losses at a speed they could never match. The ability to replace tanks was just one part of a larger American strategy of logistical warfare, where the speed of resupply and reinforcements would prove as deadly as any weapon on the battlefield. In fact, the Germans, stretched thin and with their supply lines overextended, soon realized that they were unable to sustain their operations as effectively as the Americans. The rapid American tank replacement system was more than just a tactical advantage, it was a psychological weapon that wore down German morale and hindered their ability to effectively engage the Allies. The shifting balance of power on the battlefield had less to do with raw firepower and more with the industrial and logistical superiority of the Americans. The Germans had overestimated the value of their tanks and underestimated the speed and precision of American tank replenishment and repair. As American forces pushed further into Normandy, the Germans had to contend with not only the American infantry and air support, but with the ever-present line of fresh American tanks that kept appearing on the horizon. For every Sherman they destroyed, another took its place, and the Germans were left with the harrowing realization that their strategy of attrition was failing. As the Normandy campaign progressed into its third week, it became abundantly clear to both sides that the battle was not solely about tactics, but also about who could maintain momentum and sustain their forces. The Germans, despite their formidable tanks like the Tiger I and Panther, found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. They had a smaller industrial base compared to the Allies, and were struggling with severe shortages in equipment, fuel, and reinforcements. The shortage was compounded by the relentless American logistics machine, which allowed U.S. forces to fight effectively even with considerable tank losses. For the German Wehrmacht, the belief in their superiority in tank warfare began to fade when faced with the reality of American tank replacements. The M for Sherman, which had once been dismissed as a battle taxi or inferior tank by the German, proved to be far more durable and versatile in combat than expected. While the Germans continued to produce their Panther and Tiger tanks, which were considered superior in terms of armor and firepower, their manufacturing capacities were severely strained. Moreover, these heavier tanks required complex maintenance, high fuel consumption, and intricate repair systems that were not available on the front lines. American industrial power and logistics' sheer scale of American industrial capacity became a turning point in the war. While Germany faced bombings that destroyed factories and disrupted supply chains, the United States was constantly churning out vehicles, weapons, and supplies in staggering quantities. By 1944, the U.S. was producing M for Shermans at a rate of over 8,000 per month, a production rate the Germans could not hope to match. The American logistical system was designed to keep the tanks moving forward. Tank replacement was not just about building more vehicles, it was about having the ability to get those vehicles from factories to the front lines at an unprecedented speed. Tank transporters, armored repair units, and supply depots ensured that even if a tank was destroyed, it could be replaced or repaired quickly and sent back into combat. In contrast, the German supply system was riddled with problems. Tanks like the Tiger required specialized mechanics and spare parts, which were often in short supply. Even worse, the German forces were forced to rely on long, vulnerable supply lines that could be cut off by Allied air superiority or ground attacks. As the Americans advanced through France, the Germans found it nearly impossible to maintain their equipment, especially their tanks, without access to vital resources and spare parts. The impact of these differences in logistics became painfully evident during the Battle for Saint-Lô in late July 1944. German tank crews faced wave after wave of American Sherman, often with no respite between engagement. German officers began to notice the astonishing frequency with which American tanks were replaced, and it began to chip away at their morale. Even as they destroyed tanks, more kept coming. For every Sherman that was lost, a new one appeared, fully operational and ready for battle. German commanders soon realized that they were fighting against an enemy that could replenish its forces faster than they could destroy them. This was a blow not only to their tactical plans but to their morale. Reports from German officers during the battle described the frustration of facing an endless tide of American armor. One German officer, in a report to high command, wrote, "We hit their tanks with everything we have, yet they come again. It is as though they are made of steel. We cannot break them." By contrast, as the Germans continued to suffer heavy losses, they were forced to fall back in disarray. The combination of American tank replacements, coupled with superior logistical support, gave the Allies an overwhelming advantage on the battlefield. The constant American advances overwhelmed the German defenses, which had previously relied on the ability to slow down or destroy enemy tanks. This relentless American momentum, built on tank replenishment and effective logistics, not only reshaped the battlefield but began to create a psychological toll on the Germans. They were now fighting an enemy that was not only better prepared and better equipped, but one that could recover from its losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. The Germans' biggest miscalculation was underestimating the importance of American logistics. Their tanks, once thought superior, became a liability when faced with the American system of rapid replacement and mobility. Americans were not just fighting with superior numbers, they were fighting with unprecedented industrial strength and logistical efficiency. For the German tank crews fighting in Normandy, the battle was not just about fighting the enemy. It was about the frustration of facing an adversary who refused to stop. The Germans had long prided themselves on their military strength, especially their armored divisions. The Tiger and Panther tanks, with their superior firepower and armor, were seen as the epitome of tank warfare. Yet, when these tanks were destroyed in battle, the Germans couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that followed. The Americans were already replacing their lost tanks. In the heat of battle, the psychological effect of watching American tanks emerge from the fog of war was profound. German tank crews, accustomed to retreating after a fight to regroup, suddenly found themselves in a new type of warfare. No matter how many tanks they destroyed, no matter how hard they fought, the Americans seemed to have an infinite supply of tanks to throw back into the fray. For many German officers, the realization that the Americans could continuously replenish their forces hit hard. One German tank commander, after watching a dozen fresh Shermans roll out into the field, wrote, "We killed 1, 2, maybe 3 tanks, but they came in waves without end. It was as if the Americans had endless resources. We had no time to recover. We were exhausted." The emotional toll on the German tank crews was palpable. The idea of fighting a war of attrition where the enemy was always replenished and always pressing forward, shattered their resolve. Many of the German soldiers and officers began to see their battle as futile, knowing that their tanks and resources were outmatched by the Americans' logistical superiority. From a purely tactical standpoint, the rapid replacement of American tanks had a devastating impact on the German military strategy in Normandy. The Germans had expected to leverage their technological superiority and heavily armored tanks to hold the line. They had faith that their more advanced Tiger and Panther tanks would provide them with an edge in the battle for Normandy. However, what they failed to account for was the American ability to maintain constant pressure by replenishing lost tanks and artillery almost as quickly as they were destroyed. The strategy that had worked against other enemies defending in depth, slowing the enemy, and forcing them to use up their resources was now completely ineffective against a force that had infinite resources. While the Germans concentrated on destroying Sherman's and hit-and-run tactics, they soon realized that their efforts only delayed the inevitable. The Americans would push forward relentlessly, not waiting for tanks to be replaced in days or weeks, but in hours. The Germans, unable to match this pace, were forced to adapt and rethink their tactics. They realized that no matter how many of their tanks they destroyed, the Americans would simply outlast them. Reports from German headquarters reveal a growing sense of frustration with the situation. One German general, after a series of failed counterattacks, remarked, "We may kill their tanks, but the moment we fall back, new ones arrive. We cannot stop this." In the face of this relentless American advance, the Germans were forced to shift their strategy away from fighting in fixed offensive positions and toward delaying actions, a tactic that was never enough to hold back the overwhelming American logistical machine. While the Sherman M4 tank was often considered inferior to the German Panther and Tiger tanks in terms of armor and firepower, it was the Sherman's design and its ability to adapt to battlefield conditions that made it so formidable. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank on the battlefield, but it was designed to be fast, versatile, and easy to maintain, traits that allowed it to endure throughout the campaign in Europe and beyond. One of the key reasons for the Sherman's success was its simplicity. Unlike the complex German tanks, which required a high level of technical expertise to repair, the Sherman could be repaired quickly and efficiently, even under battlefield conditions. Parts were standardized and easy to replace, and the tanks were designed to be operated by a relatively unskilled crew. This made it easier to train new soldiers and replace casualties without having to rely on highly specialized mechanics. Even when destroyed, the Sherman's quick repairability became an advantage. In the field, American engineers set up mobile repair units capable of returning Shermans to combat within hours, while a German tank like the Tiger I might require days of maintenance or even weeks to be brought back into fighting shape. A Sherman could be back in action with minimal downtime. This made the Sherman a tactical asset that could be relied upon far more consistently than its German counterparts. The American logistical model, with mobile repair teams, spare parts, and replacement tanks delivered by efficient supply lines, proved to be far more reliable than the German system, which was slower, more cumbersome, and dependent on a strained infrastructure. The Sherman's technological design, coupled with American industrial strength, made it a far more sustainable choice for the Allies, while the Germans' reliance on complex, heavily armored tanks became a liability. July 1944, Battle of Normandy. As the American forces closed in on Saint-Lô, the German defensive lines were faltering. The battle had been long and brutal, a back-and-forth struggle with both sides suffering heavy losses. But what the Germans didn't expect was the unrelenting advance of American tanks, fresh, ready, and ruthless. The American tanks, chiefly the Sherman M4, had already seen countless engagements, many of them in brutal urban warfare in the Normandy hedgerows, while the German Panther and Tiger I tanks were far superior in terms of firepower and armor. They had become increasingly vulnerable as the battle wore on. The Americans had learned how to fight against them, using speed and coordinated infantry support to target weak spots in the German tank. But it wasn't just the fighting style that had shifted the battle. It was the ability to replace lost tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Germans had already destroyed many Sherman, but to their astonishment, they saw fresh Shermans appear on the battlefield each day. The logistics behind these replacements were staggering. New tanks, repaired vehicles, and supply convoys kept American forces on the move without pause. The German High Command had assumed that their tanks, especially the Tiger I, would provide a decisive advantage against the American. But what they couldn't anticipate was the American resilience. The Sherman's ability to survive under fire, be repaired quickly, and return to combat. When a tank was destroyed, it didn't stay destroyed for long. The battlefield turned into a series of rapid tank replacements that left the German forces overwhelmed. During the Battle of Saint-Lô, German commanders began to realize just how strategically important American tank replenishment had become. Reports from the front lines describe the maddening cycle. American tanks fall, new American tanks appear, German tanks attack. The cycle repeats, asterisk at the same time. the German supply chain was increasingly unable to keep pace. Tanks like the Tiger and Panther were heavy, requiring constant maintenance and spare parts that were in short supply. German tanks, once thought to be invincible, began to falter due to the logistical difficulties of keeping them operational. The German tank factories could not replenish their losses quickly enough, and as they faced sustained airstrikes and attacks on supply depots, their production rates plummeted. American forces, on the other hand, controlled the skies with their superiority, cutting off German supply lines and ensuring their tanks remained well supplied and repaired. What had been a devastating disadvantage in earlier months had turned into the American Army's greatest strength. In St. Louis, American tanks moved from position to position, relentlessly engaging the Germans. Their ability to continue fighting despite heavy losses began to break German morale. For every Tiger I destroyed, two more Shermans appeared. The relentless American advance didn't stop. German commanders began to realize, we cannot win this war of attrition. Their tanks come faster than ours fall. It wasn't just the quantity of American tanks that turned the tide. It was the unbroken flow of replacements, repairs, and reinforcements. The American logistical system, functioning at its peak, had created a nearly unstoppable force that outpaced the Germans in every battle. The Germans were no longer just fighting the American tank crews, they were fighting the American industrial machine that kept churning out tanks at an unimaginable rate. The pivotal moment came when a German commander, observing the field, remarked, "We fight a war of attrition, but the Americans do not. They replenish faster than we can destroy them. We are at the mercy of their supply lines." And with that, it became clear. The Germans were losing not just tanks but the war of logistics. July 1944, the breakthrough at St. Louis. The battle for St. Louis and Normandy became the tipping point in the Allied breakout from the hedgerows. By the end of July, the situation for the Germans was dire. The American forces, having broken through the German lines, began to exploit their logistical superiority in full force. In a battle that had started with fierce infantry engagements, the Sherman tank began to show its true power not just as a weapon on the battlefield, but as the vehicle of a war machine that could never be stopped. As the American tanks advanced towards the city of St. Louis, German defenses crumbled under the weight of relentless artillery fire and sustained tank attacks. The Germans had expected their Panther and Tiger tanks to hold the line and push back the American, but they had underestimated the coordination of American forces and the speed of their replacements. For every German tank destroyed, 2 or 3 more Shermans rolled into place. The Germans watched in disbelief as American tanks appeared with terrifying regularity. Commanders and officers in the field scrambled to understand how the Americans managed to bring fresh tanks into the fray. Despite the heavy losses they sustained, German troops were astonished by the constant flow of new vehicles, as if the Americans had endless supplies of tanks. This was more than a tactical disadvantage for the Germans, it was a complete psychological breakdown, the realization that their best efforts to destroy American armor were being undone faster than they could keep up demoralized the German forces. They knew they could destroy a tank here, another there, but there was no end to the American assault. For every American tank that exploded in a burst of fire, a fresh one rolled onto the battlefield fully repaired and ready to fight. German reports from the front lines, intercepted by American intelligence, showed a growing sense of helplessness. One officer's dispatch read, "They are replacing their tanks as we lose ours. It is not possible to win a war like this. We cannot stop them." The American advantage lay in their logistics and the ability to resupply, repair, and replace tanks with a speed and efficiency the Germans could never match. While German tank crews fought to hold their ground, the Americans kept pushing forward, their tanks advancing with a seamless flow of support that left the German lines reeling. A turning point came when General Omar Bradley, head of the U.S. 12th Army Group, observed the German collapse firsthand. He saw that American tanks and armored units were no longer just holding positions. They were advancing with relentless speed, and every German's tactical retreat was quickly followed by a fresh American push. For the Germans, retreating was no longer an option. The battlefield had become a field of perpetual movement, one in which the Germans could not maneuver, regroup, or resupply fast enough to compete. The realization was crushing. The Americans had an unmatched supply chain, and with it, a tactical advantage that would be difficult to overcome in the coming months. German commanders, once certain that their heavier tanks would dominate, were now forced to acknowledge the ultimate truth. The Sherman's adaptability and speed in the hands of American logisticians had completely altered the balance of power. Where the Germans had once been able to claim victory by outlasting their foes, they now found themselves facing an adversary who could simply replace their losses faster than they could inflict them. In a now infamous encounter at the Villers-Bocage area, one German officer recalled the moment when the Americans, after suffering tank losses, reappeared with a new wave of tanks in such rapid succession that even their Panther and Tiger tanks were overwhelmed. The German officer, who had long believed that American tanks would buckle under the pressure, described it as the worst kind of nightmare fighting a war, where we can never take a step back without being chased forward. By August 1944, the Germans had no choice but to retreat. The German strategy of defense, once thought unbreakable, had been outpaced by the sheer speed and efficiency of the American logistical machine. Tanks that should have been destroyed were being replaced faster than they could shoot. The relentless American assault, fueled by an unbroken supply chain, was a force the Germans could not match no matter how many tanks they destroyed. By August 1944, the Battle for Normandy had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. The American tanks, especially the Sherman M4, continued their relentless advance, unbroken and seemingly endless. The Germans, having fought valiantly and with considerable strength, were now facing the collapse of their defensive lines. For all their technological superiority in tank armor and firepower, the Germans could not overcome the American logistical advantage. The psychological toll of facing a continually replenished army of Shermans was severe. German tank crews, already exhausted by weeks of intense combat, were now faced with a situation where every victory on the battlefield was swiftly negated by the arrival of fresh American armor. The Americans, using their superior logistical support systems, kept their tank forces in constant motion, while the Germans struggled to repair and replace their own vehicles. By mid-August, the Allied breakout from Normandy was in full swing. Saint-Lô, once a heavily defended German stronghold, had fallen to American forces. The Germans were forced to retreat under the pressure of an advancing tide of freshly repaired Shermans. The rapid U.S. advance shattered the Germans' defensive posture. Reports from the German High Command confirmed that they had been outpaced by the relentless American supply chain. One German general's report stated, "We cannot stop them. Their tanks come as fast as ours are destroyed. This is a fight we cannot win." The speed at which the American army replaced lost vehicles allowed them to maintain an almost unstoppable momentum. American tank battalions, despite incurring heavy losses, kept advancing as fresh units appeared daily, keeping pressure on the German positions. The Germans, unable to keep pace with the replenishment of American tanks, were forced into a strategic retreat across France. The Allied drive toward Paris, and eventually the Rhine River, was now inevitable. This rapid replacement of tanks had an immediate strategic consequence. German tank divisions, which had once been a fearsome force, were now undermined by the constant flow of American tanks. In contrast, German tank divisions, unable to replace their losses at the same pace, were rendered increasingly ineffective. The ability of the U.S. Army to mobilize and repair tanks often under fire, often in the most difficult of terrain, created a tactical advantage that the Germans simply could not counter. As the Americans advanced through France and Belgium, the consequences of their superior logistics became even clearer. In battles such as the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, the Germans found themselves cornered, with no ability to retreat or regroup effectively. The German armored divisions, once feared across Europe, were forced to fight in disjointed pockets of resistance, unable to capitalize on the advantages they once held. The psychological impact of the endless flow of American tanks reverberated throughout the German army. Not only were their own divisions defeated, but the constant reinforcement of the American forces made victory seem impossible. One captured German officer recounted, "We could see that no matter how many we destroyed, more kept coming." The war was no longer about fighting. It was about waiting for our own destruction. By the time September 1944 arrived, the Germans were already in full retreat. The U.S. victory in Normandy, powered by their logistical superiority, was not just a victory on the battlefield, it was a death blow to German morale. The tanks, once the symbols of German armored dominance, were no longer the deciding factor in the battle. It was now clear the ability to keep fighting was determined not by the strength of individual tanks, but by the speed with which the Americans could replace them. As August 1944 gave way to September, the Allied forces began their push into the heart of Germany's western defenses, with the Americans leading the charge through France and Belgium. The defeat at Normandy had set the stage for the liberation of Western Europe, and the fall of German defenses was now inevitable. But the key factor that enabled the Americans to maintain such momentum, the continual replacement of lost tanks, was still having profound consequences for the German army. The loss of German tank superiority. American logistical superiority in tank replacement didn't just affect the tactical battlefield, it shifted the strategic balance of the war. As the Germans fought desperately to hold their ground, their tank divisions were decimated, unable to replace losses at anything near the rate the Americans could manage. The Panther and Tiger tanks, which had once been seen as the backbone of the German armored forces, were now vulnerable. They consumed fuel and spare parts at an unsustainable rate, and their complex maintenance needs, combined with the Germans' deteriorating supply lines, meant that they were no longer the formidable weapon they had once been. By contrast, the Sherman M4 was designed with efficiency and ease of maintenance in mind. American tank repair units, which had been set up even before D-Day, were able to conduct repairs quickly and return damaged tanks to the battlefield. The Sherman's simplicity had fewer mechanical problems, parts were easier to replace, and it was less reliant on highly specialized mechanics, made it the perfect vehicle for fast-paced mobile warfare, where the Germans spent valuable time and resources trying to keep their heavy tanks operational. The Americans simply kept coming fresh, Sherman's rolling in from the rear and reinforcing the front lines. The American ability to keep its tank battalions operational and ready at all times was a force multiplier. Even as German tanks were being knocked out, the Americans maintained their edge. The Germans, trying to halt the American advance, began to realize their strategy was no longer effective. Every advance by American forces was met with a new wave of tanks, even after the Germans had destroyed entire armored units. For German officers who had once believed that their Tiger tanks were an unbeatable force, this realization was crushing. Their tanks, once symbols of German supremacy, had become nothing more than obstacles in the path of the American advance. The German collapse and retreat as German tank divisions were systematically destroyed and replaced by American superiority. Their ability to mount an effective defense deteriorated. By September 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was on the horizon, and the Germans were retreating at breakneck speed. Their positions in France and Belgium were being overrun by relentless American tank forces, which continued to push forward with a flow of fresh armor and supplies. The Allied drive into Germany was a direct result of the unbroken supply lines and tank replacements that allowed the Americans to maintain an unrelenting offensive. The losses suffered by the German armored divisions were staggering. Where once they had fought with the best tanks in the world, they now found themselves up against an enemy that could replace its losses faster than they could destroy them. The Germans, already on the defensive, were unable to keep up with the pace of the American offensive. Their retreat was marked by a desperate scramble to escape, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and most importantly, the tanks that had once been their pride. A German officer report from late 1944 summed up the situation. The American tanks do not stop coming. They are replacing their losses faster than we can kill them. It is no longer a battle of tanks. It is a war of resources, and we are losing. By October 1944, the German tank divisions that had been a dominant force in the early years of the war were a shadow of their former selves. The Allied tank forces, now reinforced with fresh Sherman M4s, continued to push into Germany with little resistance. The Germans were no longer in a position to mount effective counterattacks. Their loss of tank superiority was a critical turning point. The Germans, once confident in their armored divisions, were now fighting a war of attrition they could not win. The final push and legacy as the American forces continued to advance through Belgium and toward the Rhine River, the German army's inability to sustain its armored divisions became more and more apparent. By the time the Battle of the Bulge began in December 1944, the Germans were fighting a desperate battle against a well-supplied, well-equipped American army that had an endless flow of reinforcement. The American ability to replace tanks faster than they could be destroyed was a defining feature of the Allied victory in Europe. In the years following the war, military strategists and historians would point to the U.S. logistical advantage, the ability to repair and replace tanks quickly, as one of the key factors in their success. It was a logistical revolution that turned the Sherman tank into a symbol of American resilience and industrial strength. The German failure to replace their tanks at the same pace had effectively sealed their fate. In retrospect, the ability to replace tanks in hours instead of weeks, to maintain constant pressure on the enemy, and to keep moving forward without pause, became a defining characteristic of the American military effort in the Second World War. For the Germans, the knowledge that they were fighting an enemy whose resources seemed endless was demoralizing, and this realization, the inability to stop the continuous flow of fresh American tanks, was one of the key factors in the ultimate collapse of the German military machine in 1944. Logistical superiority demonstrated by the United States during World War II remains one of the most profound, yet often overlooked, factors in the Allied victory. As the war progressed, the Germans learned a brutal truth: the ability to replace losses in real time, whether in tanks, artillery, or infantry, could make or break a campaign. The relentless appearance of fresh American Shermans on the battlefield, even after they were destroyed, shattered the German army's resolve and showed the true power of American industry and logistics. The Sherman M4 was not the most advanced tank on the battlefield. It lacked the sheer firepower of the German Tiger I or the superior armor of the Panther. Yet, it was reliable, easy to repair, and designed for mass production, enabling it to dominate the battlefield through sheer numbers and adaptability. The American logistical machine, fueled by factories and repair depots back home and in the field, provided the sustained firepower that the Germans simply could not match. This advantage was not just tactical, it was strategic. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on their technological innovations, were ultimately undone by their inability to adapt to the scale of the American industrial effort. They could no longer match the Allies in a war of attrition. Tank battles became less about individual strength and more about the endless flow of replacement tanks. That ensured the Americans could continue fighting, while the Germans were forced to fall back and regroup. The Germans simply couldn't replace their heavy armor fast enough, and their tanks, once seen as the pinnacle of warfare, began to fail them on the battlefield. In many ways, the victory in Normandy and the subsequent liberation of France were a testament to the unsung heroes of the war: the engineers, the factory workers, and the supply lines that enabled American forces to maintain the initiative. The battlefield was not just defined by firepower and strategy, but by the invisible hand of logistics that ensured the continuous flow of resources to the front lines. The ability to replace tanks to keep the war machine rolling forward was, perhaps, the most decisive factor in defeating Nazi Germany. In the end, the American industrial machine was as powerful a weapon as any tank or gun. Its relentless production and the logistical systems that could keep pushing forward without stopping were the key to the Allied victory in the European theater. For the German commanders who thought they could win through sheer firepower, the war's outcome would be a painful reminder that resilience in logistics was just as important as resilience on the battlefield.